for tonight. So going back through all this stuff, but I started back on the slide that talks about the appearances. I won't talk about more about that just in a minute. We'll get to another slide, but going back and look at the appearances we've already talked about after the resurrection. Mary Magdalene, the other women. Mary went back to the tomb. The angels won't know why she's weeping. They've taken the Lord. I don't know where they put him. But she thought they had moved the body somewhere. Resurrection was not in her mind. Okay. Jesus behind her speaks to her. She don't recognize it. Thinks she's the gardener. And then he calls her by name, and she realizes it's the Lord. So then she's the first one to have seen him alive. Was Mary Magdalene when she went back to the tomb. So other women, Jesus greets them. They fall at his feet, worship him. So a group of women this time saw him, and he tells everybody to go back to Galilee, and I'll meet you there. So that keep that in mind. We're going to hear that later. We get it tonight. So they now realize that we're beginning to realize he's risen, but it's going to be hard. We're going to see that tonight. Hard for them to understand that's really what's happened. Okay. So, last 18. We got 3 other appearances to look at. So we'll start with them tonight. The first one is on the road to Emmaus. Jerusalem in the middle with the arrow there, and the probable site of Emmaus is off to the west, northwest a little bit on the map there. This is Jerusalem, back up into here. This is the old road that comes down to Emmaus. Just a new highway that way, but this is the road that comes down here. So it'll be coming from Jerusalem down to Emmaus there. This is a picture from that village in the early 1900s. You kind of see what it looks like for all the current modernization that you saw on the last slide up there. So this is still on the first day of the week. It's still the day he arose. And there are 2 disciples leaving Jerusalem, going back to their home in Emmaus. And they're talking about, obviously, like everybody would be, what's been going on in Jerusalem, particularly if you're a disciple of Jesus. What's happened to him? He's been crucified. And now there's some word getting out he's risen and he's not in the tomb anymore. So they're talking about it. So this stranger comes in and joins up with them and says, what are you talking about? What's going on? And they're amazed. He's going the same direction they are, coming out of Jerusalem. You've been in Jerusalem all this time, and you don't know what's going on in Jerusalem, all the talks about and everything? And he says, what things? Of course, it's Jesus that's talking to them. They don't know that, though. So they tell him what's been happening and what they were expecting to come from the Messiah, which didn't, of course. And then what had really happened to him, that he's been killed by the Romans. And then this part here. He scolded them and rehearsed them all the prophets had said about him. Can you imagine hearing Jesus going back and picking up with the prophets and telling all the things as they walk along that the prophets had said would happen to him, about him, the whole story being revealed by Jesus himself to these 2 disciples as they walk along? He rehearsed to them all the things the prophets had said about him, which I'm sure would include his death, burial, and resurrection. So they're going along amazed at this conversation. So they get to Emmaus, and was the common thing then. There was a stranger going along and needed a place to stay. We see the phrase a lot in the New Testament, given to hospitality. So they invited him in to stay the night with them. As they were eating the meal, their eyes were opened, and they realized it's Jesus. You just got to put yourself there to think how they would have felt and reacted when they think about it's flashing into their mind the last few minutes as they've been walking on this road. He's been telling them all these things the prophets have said about him, and then you realize it's him. Okay, it's him. He just told me all about what was going to happen? He just rehearsed it to me. Jesus himself. So he vanished. He's gone. They leave immediately and go back to Jerusalem to tell the other disciples that we've seen the Lord. He's risen. We talked to him. This phrase here, did not our hearts burn within us while he taught with us on the road and while he opened the scriptures to us? That was their reply, their thought. Our hearts burned within us as he opened the scriptures to us, as he told us from the scriptures about himself. Our hearts burned within us. So a little question on the side here. Have you ever heard a sermon where your heart just melted inside? It could be any number of things. It could be a sermon about heaven and the blessing and how great it's going to be. And you're just sitting there just entranced in it, the lesson there, and you're inside just. Or it could be some sin that the preacher's preaching about, and it hits you, and your heart's hit with it. The phrase is, our hearts burn within us as he opened the scriptures to us. So they get back to where the disciples are, and before they can tell their side of the story, Peter talks about the fact he's now seen the Lord. And so they understand that, but here's the big thing. At this point, where even with Peter having seen him, the women have seen him, now these two disciples have come back and see him, they still don't believe as a group. They still don't believe as a group that he is really alive. They can't imagine it. I mean, you got to put yourself. We look back and we see it now. Yeah. Oh, why did it? Put yourself back there. Mark 16:13. They went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. They just can't get it. He's really risen from the dead. It's him. So that same evening, you got the resurrection, that first day of the week. The other appearances we talked about, this trip to Emmaus. They've come back to Jerusalem, and that's late in the evening there. They were eating, I don't know exactly who. Sometimes the word disciples is used to talk about just the core group. Or it could be a broader group of people, including the apostles and some of the other disciples. They were eating, and Jesus appeared in their midst with them there. And at this point, they still thought it was a ghost because they still don't have it in their mind he's risen from the dead, even at this point. So he says, touch me. Does a ghost have flesh and bones? And I thought about this part quite a bit. If God had the power to raise Jesus from the dead, and he did, okay, could he not have risen, put the body back with all the scars healed up and whatever? Why did he leave it would be scars at this point, it'd be wounds, I guess. Why would he leave those there? Well, you've got to know this is the same person who was on the cross, okay? So they're all there. So he shows them his hands, his feet, where the nails were in there. And then Luke 22:44 talks about all the things, we just talk about Jesus rehearsing all the prophets said about him. This passage makes the point that everything in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, they're all named individually. Sometimes you get the law and the prophets as an inclusive type thing of the Old Testament. This time it names the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And you might think about, we've had a lot of things in the Psalms that we've talked about that involve the crucifixion and the things surrounding it. Referenced a number of times in the Psalms. So maybe that's why they're listed out separate here. But all things concerning him have now been fulfilled. Jesus came to fulfill the law, not. So the next verse says, he opened their understanding that they might comprehend the scriptures. Let that die just a minute. He opened their understanding that they might comprehend the scriptures. What scriptures? Well, all these prophecies he's talked about with the two guys going to Emmaus. Everything is in the law, the Psalms, and the prophets and the Psalms about him. He opened their eyes, opened their understanding, so they might comprehend the scriptures. So there is a lesson here, I think, too. And those who are teaching the old ones that are old enough to understand this, we don't just read through the scriptures. We need to read with comprehension. We need to understand. Okay, to comprehend means to mentally grasp something. It's complete nature and meaning. So we read it to comprehend it. Marcia, she knew I was saying this, particularly if it was being recorded. Marcia called me last night and she's working on Romans for your group? No, yeah, okay. And she was telling about how all the work and time she put into Romans. And she said, I went through and just looked at all the Hebrew stuff in there. Just take all the Greeks out and just talk about everything that's said, rehearsed about the Hebrew part. All the scriptures that reference back to the old Hebrew. You just read through those. And so there's just a whole theme in itself if you go through there. So she's digging into, my point is she's digging into it to see what's inside the book. Digging into it. We don't just blast through this stuff. Reading to comprehend. Back in Ezra and Nehemiah's day, all the people assembled and they stood while the book of the law was being read to them. Y'all remember that part from there? This is the next day after that. And they came back the next day. On the second day, the heads of the father's household, all the people, the priests, and the Levites gathered to Ezra the scribe that they might gain insight, the text says, into the word. Gain insight. So that's a lesson I think we can get not only for us, but for those who are old enough that you're teaching, that they just start learning to understand what they're reading. Remember the eunuch? Do you understand what you're reading? I need someone to explain it to me. So Jesus is there with him. Go back to the story now. He's there with them and eating. And he says, they don't realize he is the Spirit. Ask for food. Does the Spirit, if he's a ghost, does the Spirit eat and drink and understand and these kind of things? So he's trying to get them gradually to see who he is. So he rebukes them. And that's a kind of a scary thing that he rebukes them for not believing what they've been told by the others who have seen him. Because they did not believe those that see him after he'd been risen. Why? Again, we'll get to this more in a minute. But the appearances to others and their testimony and their words are going to be important. So hang that thought a minute. Another slide here, I'll talk about that. So, after this, they accept his resurrection as being fact. He breathes on them. They receive the Holy Spirit. I don't know how this compares to the Holy Spirit and what came on Pentecost. And we'll get into all that tonight. That's a whole separate topic. But that point is made there. And Thomas was not there. So we get this phrase, doubting Thomas. Why is he doubting? Well, the same reason the others had doubted. Okay? We in our minds, we get on Thomas, well, he didn't believe. Others didn't believe either. You got to keep that in your mind the whole time. It's not just Thomas. So Thomas said he wouldn't believe till he could actually touch and see the nail scars for himself. The others didn't believe either. Now, over the next 40 days before his ascension, this is going to kind of stick a slide in here, and then we'll kind of come back to the story here. He's going to appear to the apostles a week later, 7 disciples by the Sea of Galilee, 500 brethren at once, and James. All are listed as separate over the next, between now and the time it's going to, the ascension. And we'll kind of get back to these in a minute, but I just want to get that in. There's going to be a lot of it. A lot of appearances come in. The apostles then, when he gave the Great Commission and ascended back to heaven. So a week later, Jesus appears with them again, and Thomas is there with them this time. And you know the story, you've been through it. So Jesus appears in there, the door's locked, so how do you get in? Well, he's a ghost, he can hang to the wall, right? No, there's a ghost, doesn't eat and drink. He tells Thomas to touch him and believe. You want to touch me? To know it, who it is? Well, here I am. Touch me and believe. Thomas didn't have to touch him. My Lord and my God. He knew who he was. He recognized it. And now his unbelief is gone. Thomas now believes. Then we have this passage. And we'll go get to it at the end of class again. But let's now the first part particularly. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and believe. Now I got the question mark up there because some translations make that first part a question as opposed to a statement. I don't know which one, what you've got, how it's in there, but there are some who put a question mark there, some put a statement. So read it that way. Thomas, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me yet believe. If you put the question mark there. You believe because you've seen me? Blessed are those who believe who haven't seen me. Or just Thomas, because you've seen me, you believe. Blessed are those who have not seen me yet believe. Either way, it's the same point, whether it's a question mark or not. But I want to bring it out because some translations have it one way and some the other. So now we're going to Galilee. Over and over, they had talked about Jesus would meet them in Galilee. He told the women that early on that he would meet them in Galilee. Tell them to meet me in Galilee. So now they're in Galilee. By the way, it is the New Revised Standard that puts a question mark there, just in case you haven't had it. So at the Sea of Galilee, Peter and some of the others have gone back to their old occupation and gone out fishing. They've been fishing all night. They haven't caught anything. So this man on the shore says, cast your net off on the right side of the boat. But you kind of got to put it again. Okay, I'm a fisherman. I've been fishing all night and I haven't caught anything yet. And you want me to do it again? Okay, so he does. They've cast it on the right side of the boat. The net was so full, they couldn't pull it in with fish. What's the reaction going to be? Who could tell us to do that? And it happened like that, except Jesus himself. It's the Lord. They recognize who it is, just because of the miracle he's done. So Jesus was cooking breakfast and invited them to come and eat with him there. It's the third time he's appeared to them, the apostles, since the resurrection. Without Thomas, with Thomas, and now this appearance here. He asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And every time Peter replies, yes, I do, Lord. And he says, feed or tend my sheep. Now, why 3 times? I don't know why 3 times. There's a lot of speculation that he asked him that 3 times because Peter had denied him 3 times. So he asked him 3 times about, do you love me? I don't know if there's a connection there between the two or not, but that is looked at sometimes that way. So that Jesus, I have to go back and Google this, and I forgot it this afternoon. Jesus talked about to Peter about the type death he would die. If I remember secular history correctly, Peter died in a crucifixion upside down. No, don't bank on that. I meant to go back and refresh it this afternoon to be sure, but that's what's been stuck in my mind, that he would not be crucified like his Lord. So he won't be crucified upside down. So you might Google that sometime and check on it. But I think that's what I remember from times past. This is the one I want to talk about. 1 Corinthians 15, we know is the chapter on the resurrection. And Paul defends the fact that Christ is raised from the dead. Otherwise, if he hadn't been raised from the dead, our faith is vain, our hope is in vain, everything. But he is risen, Paul says. He lists out then, after he starts talking about the death, burial, and resurrection, he starts listing all of these appearances Jesus made to the different people. When he did over 500 at once, appeared to James, later to Paul himself. Christ is risen. That's the point Paul's making in 1 Corinthians 15. So why list all these appearances? That's the point I will get to now. Why is it important? Is it important that all these appearances be listed that we've been talking about, some last week and again tonight? What if we didn't have the appearances? Well, there was no record in the scriptures about Jesus being seen after the resurrection. Now what? Can I see the importance of stressing this to your class? That Jesus not only was raised, people saw him, and those people are testifying to us they saw him. How do you know Chicago exists? Some of y'all have probably been there. How do you know it's there? Well, because somebody that knows, has seen it, told me it was there. And I believe them. Or you take any kind of illustration you want to. Appearances and testimony is significant. Also, we got to think at this point. Christ is risen, so what? Satan's defeated. Go back to Genesis 3:15, the very early part of scriptures themselves. When Christ died, it looked like Satan had won, right? But now that he's risen, conquered death, put down Satan. Satan is defeated. Jesus has crushed his head. So, a couple lessons. He rebuked them that unbelief because they did not believe those who had seen him after the resurrection. The testimony of these people who saw him is crucial to our belief, to our understanding, to our acceptance that Christ is risen from the dead. Okay? So when sufficient evidence has been presented, I've got to draw that conclusion. Now your students have got to draw that conclusion. That yes, Christ died, he was buried, he rose. How did I know he rose? All these people saw him. Be sure you get that point across to them, that people saw him at the resurrection, and they have written it and they have told us, and we believe it because of that evidence. Let's go back to this verse we looked at earlier. Blessed are those who have not seen me, yet have believed. Who is that? Who are the ones that haven't seen him and yet believe? But that's us, okay? Look what it said about him. Truly, Jesus had many other signs from the presence of his disciples who were not written in this book, but what? These are written that you may believe, that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing we may have life in his name. Get that to your students. This is important, okay? Why did Jesus do all these miracles? Why is all this stuff recorded for us? Why we got it written down? Why do we believe testimony of these people? It's important to us. These things are written that we haven't seen Jesus. Blessed are those who believe and haven't seen him. And what's the results of it? These are all written down. This testimony is written down for us, that we might believe that he is the Son of God, and because of that belief, we have life in his name. One more point about 1 Corinthians 15. I kind of alluded to it a bit earlier. In the context of these appearances, Paul has said, I preach to you the gospel, which you believe and you've held on to. If indeed you believe, and he talks about the death, the burial, and the resurrection. The core part of the gospel. Right behind that's when he puts these appearances. Okay? This is the core part. You got to understand the death, the burial, and the resurrection. And to prove the resurrection, Paul goes right behind that, the first part of 1 Corinthians 15, and lists the fact that the appearances were there. And so that's all I've got.